In Luke 14, verse 26, Jesus says that we need to hate our family in order to love him. Is Jesus really saying that we need to hate our family? And doesn't this contradict what he says about loving others? And what about the 10 commandments that say we need to honor our father and mother? Today, we're going to take a deeper look into this passage and understand what it's saying. We're going to start by looking at the context around Luke chapter 14. Then we're going to look at the word hate and how it's used in the Bible. And lastly, we're going to understand what this passage is saying. The context of Luke chapter 14 is all about cost. Jesus is turning to the crowd of people following him and explaining what it is going to cost them to be followers of him. What's interesting is that most people try and downplay the cost of something. If you want people to follow you, you're going to try and make the cost seem as small and manageable as possible. And yet Jesus doesn't pull any punches here. He makes it clear that there is a high cost to following him. Jesus starts in verse 26 by saying this: "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Jesus doesn't stop there. He keeps going. In verse 27, he says this: "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." In Jesus' time, the cross represented the worst possible way to die. So for Jesus to say to bear your cross was an extreme thing. Jesus then goes on to give two examples of how it is wise to count the cost before making a big decision. He talks about building a tower. A wise person is going to sit before they build a tower and plan out exactly how much it's going to cost. It'd be foolish to just start building a tower. Maybe you pour the foundation and start building some of the walls, and then you run out of money. Now you have a half-finished building that serves nothing, and you wasted all of these resources to build this. That would be foolish. Instead, a wise builder will plan beforehand to make sure that he has what it costs to build a tower. Jesus gives another example of a king going to war with another king. It would be foolish for this king to attack the other king without first counting his army and counting his opponent's army. If his opponent's army was way larger than his army, it would be much wiser for this king to seek for peace instead of going to war. A wise person looks at what it costs to do something before they go through with it. Now, this context of cost is really important to understanding Luke 14:26. Jesus is making it clear you need to understand the cost of following me. And he doesn't pull any punches in saying exactly what it's going to cost for people to follow him. Now we're going to take a deeper look at verse 26. We're specifically going to look at this word hate. The difficulty with this verse is Jesus saying that we need to hate our father, hate our mother, hate our family. How we use the word hate today doesn't really make any sense with this verse because it would contradict everything that Jesus says we're supposed to do. Jesus says that the most important commandments are to love God and love other people. Jesus even tells us to love our enemies. Jesus upholds the 10 commandments, which make it very clear that we're supposed to honor our father and mother. It wouldn't make any sense for Jesus to say we should be actively hostile towards our family. When we look at the context of Scripture, we're going to find that the way Jesus is using hate here means something a little different. In biblical language, when two things are being compared, the word hate can be referring to the thing that is loved less than the other. This is weird to us today because we don't really speak like this, but we find examples of this use throughout Scripture. Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Jesus says here that if we compare two things, God and money, you cannot love both of them. You cannot serve both of them. You must love one more than the other. And by comparison, you will hate the other. And we just know this to be true. You can only love one thing the most. If I have to choose between God and money, I can't serve both. We see examples of this in the Old Testament as well. In Genesis, we read about the story of Jacob, who has two wives, and that's a topic for another video. But the important thing to focus on here is the two things being compared, Jacob's two wives, Leah and Rachel. Here's what we read in Genesis. "And he loved Rachel more than Leah and served Laban for another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." So Genesis 29:31 says that Leah was hated, but the verse before that, verse 30, clarifies what hated means here. It says that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. So this hate is in comparison to how much he loves Rachel. Again, we don't speak like this today, but this is the language the Bible uses, and we need to read verses in that context. What helps tie this all together is another passage we have of Jesus teaching on this very same topic of cost and family. Here Jesus is speaking in Matthew chapter 10, and he says this: "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. This passage in Matthew chapter 10 helps clarify Luke chapter 14. Jesus says, if you love your father and mother more than me, if you love your son or daughter more than me, you cannot follow me. And again, he mentions taking up your cross to follow him. So bringing this all together, what is Luke 14:26 saying? Jesus is telling us to hate our family and even our own lives, but that hate is in comparison to how much we love God. I cannot love my wife and Jesus equally. I cannot love my dad and Jesus equally. I must love Jesus the most, and in comparison, hate everything else. This doesn't mean hate in the way that we generally use the word today. Rather, this means love less than my love for Jesus. This understanding of hate is perfectly in line with what Jesus is saying. And this just makes sense. You can only love one thing the most. And Jesus makes this clear. The cost of following Jesus is to love Jesus the most. We must hate everything else in comparison. And this is definitely a convicting message to me as well, because what Jesus says is if we're wise, we need to count the cost. Am I willing to give up anything in my life to follow Jesus? This is a difficult and convicting question. My prayer for myself and you is that we answer that yes, I am willing to give up anything to follow Jesus, no matter what it costs me. This teaching in Luke chapter 14 does not contradict the 10 commandments or Jesus' commandments about loving other people. Rather, Jesus is saying here that if you are serious about being a follower of him, you need to love him more than anything else. I hope this video was helpful to you. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.